Good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us. So this is a panel on corporate activism and lobbying. We have a really incredible panel with us today. The topic of this generally is that in order to protect our planet, we need strong government policies, things like carbon pricing and banning plastics and fossil fuels and so on. But according to research, 89% of corporate lobbying exists to block policies that would result in climate positive action. And so we convened this panel to talk about this topic because as an environmental activist myself and as a sustainability expert in business, what I consistently find is that policy and lobbying is a massive blind spot for most corporates. And in fact, the only corporates that are particularly interested and sophisticated when it comes to lobbying are the major polluters. So this was something that I was really keen to talk to this expert panel about, who have all got various different insights on this aspect of activism and lobbying. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Tom Brake. So Tom is the director of Unlock Democracy, campaigning for democratic reforms in the UK, including for a written constitution and greater transparency and accountability of government. He was a member of Parliament for 20 years and a minister for 3 years. During his time in Parliament, he championed extending freedom of information and was part of the ministerial team responsible for the lobbying and recall of MP reforms. Next to him is Sophie Dembinski, and Sophie is the Global Head of Policy and Climate Action at Ecosia, one of the world's largest non-profit tech and reforestation organizations. She leads on tech and environmental advocacy and building scalable solutions to the climate crisis. She's also an advisory board member for Stop Ecocide International and is a qualified psychological therapist working with an interest in climate anxiety and leadership. And next to Sophie, I'm sure doesn't need a massive amount of introduction in this forum, is Carla Denyer, who is the co-leader of the Green Party for England and Wales. She's been a Bristol City Councillor since 2015 and is the Green Party candidate for Bristol Central in the next general election. In 2018, Carla proposed the first climate emergency declaration in Europe, committing Bristol to become carbon neutral by 2030. Carla previously worked as an engineer in the renewables sector, specializing in onshore and offshore wind. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Tessa Vernick. And Tessa is a business activist, social entrepreneur, and facilitator. And I think you might have, some of you in the room, hopefully most of you, one of the products that she's connected to in your pocket. Tessa is a co-founder of Fairphone. She turned a campaign for fairer electronics into an impact-driven business. She's interviewed dozens of entrepreneurs and change makers on her podcast series, What If We Get It Right? And her current enterprise is The Undercover Activist, which is a learning hub for employee-led change. She coaches young professionals to be optimistic and confident, taking action to change organizations from within, which I think is something that we all applaud. So thank you very much. And finally, I'll introduce myself. My name is Georgia Elliott-Smith. I am the managing director of a sustainability consultancy called Element 4. We work with organizations to create really progressive activist sustainability strategies. And I'm also a legal activist as well, and in 2021 took the UK government to court over their failure to price carbon emissions in the waste sector. And it was as a result of that that I came across lobbying. And when I came across lobbying, I was so shocked. I had never experienced anything like it, and I realized the whole world needed to know about this. So that takes me, Tom, to you. My first question. What is lobbying?
Well, the simple definition of lobbying is trying to influence legislators. So trying to influence the people who make the law of the land. And I suppose that the first thing I should do is to confess that I am a lobbyist myself. Mm-hmm. So Unlock Democracy, we're an organization that campaigns for democratic reforms. We have just spent the last 3 weeks lobbying all the political parties, including Carla's, at the Green Party conference to try to get them to adopt the policies that we believe the UK needs. We were, to some extent, wasting our time at the Green Party conference because they support all the things that we're campaigning for. So hopefully that demonstrates that there is nothing wrong with lobbying per se, and it's more a question about, in my view, about the transparency of lobbying and the extent to which people can see and hear about the lobbying that's going on, and also see and hear about it at the time that it is happening. So there are rules, for instance, about what ministers have to report, but what they tend to do is to report it perhaps 9 or 12 months after it's actually happened. So if they're meeting businesses, for instance, about a particular bill that is going through the House of Commons, I think civil society wants to be able to intervene and at that point and say, look, Minister, you have met 10 organisations from the oil industry and no one from the other side of the argument. So for me, I think trying to improve on the transparency of lobbying and ensuring that the lobbying that is happening is reported quickly is what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at this point I'd like to just point you to the Slido. So there should be a QR code up. There we go. If you could just take a snap of this QR code and answer our poll, that would be really helpful to get an insight of your experiences. So what we would like to know is, have you ever been involved in any kind of lobbying? And we'll continue talking to the panel and then come back to that answer in a moment. So thanks very much, Tom. So Sophie, on to you next. What's your personal experience of lobbying? Because I know that you are quite deeply involved in this as your day-to-day role.
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, Tom mentioned the party conferences and transparency within the UK kind of lobbying space. I think it's important to note that even though we're still kind of in party conference season, we are a month and a half out of COP28. And at COP28, we're likely to see a large number of oil and gas lobbyists descend on the UAE, and it's going to be really interesting to see how much transparency there is there in those negotiations and discussions, right? So I think that also brings me to one of my points, which is that corporate activism and lobbying in the climate space is really, really needed, and it can really, really work. But it's really hard, right? And I think we all know that, and many people also in the room, I suspect, or we'll find out, you know, in their own lobbying efforts over time, you know, will have had experience, you know, which shows just how hard it can be to make a change in this space. And it's not just hard because it's difficult to navigate, you know, the policy world. I mean, you know, when it comes to lobbying, you've got everything from the local, the national, the regional level, and the global, like at COP28, or indeed, you know, the G20. And then you've got the whole kind of horizontal, different types of sectors, issue areas, etc. So it's a real patchwork if you want to try to understand how policy works and where you can make a real change. So it's difficult to navigate, but it's also really resource intensive, right? And when you're a small organization like Ecosia, and I've sat in a number of different seats at the lobbying or kind of in the policy you know, roundtable world and things like that, as an NGO, as a think tank, as a business, representing clients at a law firm, you know, where you basically sit is often where you stand on certain issues, right? And that's really important to know. But you also have your own agency within that, and I'm sure we'll come to that because this space is changing quite a lot. So just to say, in terms of my experience of what works, as a smaller organization, because these activities can be very resource intensive in terms of people's time, money, etc., you're often up against companies with huge amounts of resources, let's say oil and gas industries. And in my case, as we're a search engine, we use the money from the search engine to plant trees and fund other types of climate activism, renewable energy, that kind of thing. The rule we basically use here is 80-20. So you pick a policy area or an issue that you care really deeply about, and you need your buy-in from, you know, ideally the CEO, etc., so that it's really embedded within the company. And you really focus on that issue. So in our case, it's related to reforestation and therefore protecting our trees and as much land as possible from deforestation. So I focus a lot on deforestation policy. I think that came up in the last panel as well. So we pick one area, right? Let's say trees. And with the remaining 20% of our time and resources, we can focus on amplifying the voices of other causes because, of course, we need systemic change. So to my mind, in my experience, because the space is difficult to navigate and there's a hell of a lot to do, I would say that where I've seen corporate activism being most successful is where you really go with one issue and you get to know it really well across the whole of the funnel from kind of cultural change all the way through to regulatory change.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Focusing your effort, because I think that's it. It doesn't just have a financial toll, it has an emotional toll as well. These are slow burn issues sometimes.
Yeah.
So on to you next then, Carla. I think a lot of people see lobbying as being a dirty word, and rightly so, because I think, that statistic at the top tells us 89% of current corporate lobbying is about regressive policy or blocking climate policy. So do you think then that it's right for us to borrow the tactics of the polluters and follow in their footsteps to be effective? Or do you think that we should be blocking those tactics and trying to shut that down?
In short, I think the answer is both. This quandary feels very familiar because that decision that ethical businesses have to make has a strong parallel in the position that the Green Party finds ourselves in that we would rather be part of a political system that has a proportional voting system, an elected rather than crony-filled House of Lords, and so on. But in order to achieve those changes, we have to operate within the system we have now, and so we stand candidates for election, even in this unfair system, in order to go about changing it at the same time as lobbying for those policies, as Tom was saying. So I really think it's both. In terms of reining in the bad stuff, changing the policies so that the very worst kinds of untransparent, bordering on corrupt and certainly regressive lobbying happens, that's mostly about changing legislation. So that's mostly up to us politicians. So that's things like Tom said, but I'll add to that list, political donations. Because there are, believe it or not, no caps on donations to political parties. So that means a very rich person can literally buy an election. There are spending limits in individual campaigns, but there are not donation limits. And so some political parties get very large influential donations from a small number of very rich people. And so Natalie Bennett, one of my predecessors, former leader of the Green Party and now a member of the House of Lords, put down an amendment to the elections bill recently which aimed to ban overly large donations to political parties. The Green Party wants to see a cap on individual donations, better transparency and accountability. That's going to be a theme, I think. And controversially perhaps, but hear me out, state funding for political parties. That actually already happens in Germany. And it's a way of ensuring that all political parties, whether they're in government or opposition, have access to good policy making. So in Germany, it's done by state funding of think tanks that are linked to each political party. So that's the kind of policy change that we could see. But in the meantime, the promoting the good stuff, the good lobbying, that's mostly up to you as ethical business people. And so that's things, I think, like being active in the existing mainstream business organisations, because that's an area where I can't do that for you. Those clubs they don't admit political parties as members, they admit businesses. And I think that while specific business organisations for ethical businesses have a really important role, being active in the CBIs and FSBs of this world is also important, because you can be sure the bad guys are going to. So you need to be involved as well, because then you can pull them in the right direction. I think there's also arguments for engaging in Parliament through engaging in the all-party parliamentary groups, sending your staff to intern with MPs if it's possible, because again, you can be sure the bad guys are doing it, and I'd be not doing my job if I didn't end it on this, donate to the politicians that share your values, because again, you can be sure the bad guys are doing it.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So these are the tactics that we can learn from.
Yeah, and I've got a bunch of detailed examples that I'm happy to go into.
Yes,
one as
yeah,
well.
I know some very interesting stories from your time in the trenches. Yeah.